Turkey's election has been under the microscope of editorial boards of major Western media outlets from the Washington Post to the New York Times to the Economist and more.
It's being called one of the world's most important elections, but the predictions of major media outlets are coming under fire for their bias, with forecasts that turned out to be wildly inaccurate.
So why are many of these media big hitters failing to accurately report about an election that will certainly have major geopolitical implications worldwide? Let's start with The Economist, a notable British weekly magazine with a circulation of over 1.6 million readers. Their reporting on international affairs is influential in policy circles and can set the tone for other media coverage on world events.
As you can see by their headline, their reporting on Turkey's elections is based on the paper's desire for one specific outcome.
They're not hiding it. Turkish President Erdogan shocked media outlets like The Economist when he pulled a better than expected first-round result of 49.5% of the vote compared to his main opponent Kemal Kılıçdaroğlu with 45%. Nonetheless, the voting process was transparent and fair by all accounts. Even the Turkish opposition said as much.
But The Economist wants you to believe that it's somehow a blow to democracy.
And that seems to be a common theme among much of the biased Western mainstream media coverage of these elections. Essentially, if the guy we support loses, then it's not a democratic outcome, according to them. And what does having a disruptive policy, as The Economist puts it, in the Middle East really mean?
The wording here is key: an independent, robust foreign policy in a region where Turkey shares thousands of kilometers along its border becomes called disruptive by a strongman because it's not to the liking of The Economist's editorial board.
So let's look at the facts. It's not just The Economist, but also the New York Times criticizing Turkey's foreign policy and thus hoping for an election result that would be more in line with their own worldview. Now, if you believe these headlines, an Erdogan win would trigger, quote, Western anxiety, and European leaders hope for a, quote, easier Turkey.
A different and fairer way of looking at it could be to describe Turkey's foreign policy as charting its own unique, independent path.
Yes, it's undeniable that Turkey has cordial diplomatic and economic relations with Moscow at a time of heightened tensions between the US and Russia. At the same time, Turkey recently took out the leader of the Daesh terror group in northwest Syria and has provided critical military support to Ukraine, according to senior Ukrainian officials I've spoken with. And Turkey has also worked closely with the EU on border security.
Hard to see how that could trigger Western anxiety, and the opposition leader Kemal Kılıçdaroğlu himself has said that if he wins, Turkey will still pursue positive relations with Moscow.
And here, the Washington Post jumps on this bandwagon. The echo chamber has a common theme. Turkish-Russian relations somehow, quote, undercut the NATO military alliance.
And that a democratic election is equated with, quote, despotism, despite the fact that the people are making their voices heard.
And when the results of the democratic election in Turkey became clear, it came as a shock to the media echo chamber bias. The polls and predictions by the so-called experts were wrong. And the results of the May 14th ballot in Turkey led to some introspection amongst the media.
Some media outlets struggle to accept Turkey's electoral reality, but they also failed to objectively cover Turkey's role as a power broker in the region.
The media wants you to believe that an Erdogan re-election would equate with a Russian win of some sorts. But here you have the Ukrainian President Zelensky thanking the Turkish leader for his support following the Russian attack.
And yet the media still attacks what is otherwise a nuanced and balanced foreign policy that made the grain deal possible.
And in the middle of Europe's deadliest war in modern memory, no less. By omitting such context, news outlets end up misleading their readers, which raises the question, why are we seeing such a uniform, one-sided take by leading media outlets? For instance, Politico EU tried to outdo The Economist in pushing hard for an Erdogan election defeat. In doing so, they amplified opinion polls that turned out to be incredibly inaccurate. So let's look at that polling data in the lead up to the first round of the presidential and parliamentary vote in Turkey. As you can see, opinion polls were all over the place in the weeks before the ballot. Polling companies like Conda and Metropol had the most inaccurate data, which had Kılıçdaroğlu taking the lead before the first round. Conda predicted that Kılıçdaroğlu would get 49.3%, while Erdogan gets 43.7%, which was almost the opposite of the real outcome. Sonar and Genar made the closest predictions, with Sonar saying Erdogan takes 48.8% and Kılıçdaroğlu 44.1%. And Genar had 51.4% for Erdogan. These type of opinion polls are important because they can have an influencing effect on voter behavior before people cast their ballots. They can either raise expectations or dash hopes.
Indeed, and in an interview with DW, the owner of the Metropole polling company admitted that they had conducted polls before the May 14 election that had Erdogan in the lead, but they chose to not publish the results just because it would be against Nations Alliance presidential candidate Kemal Kılıçdaroğlu.
And Western mainstream media coverage chose to cherry-pick polling data that fit their belief that Kılıçdaroğlu would win. Overall, if you average out the result of the polling data before May 14th, Kılıçdaroğlu was being predicted as coming out well in the lead with 48.9% of the vote.
But as you can see, Erdogan took a commanding lead in the first round presidential election, and his political coalition has a solid majority in the parliament.
And that seemed to have a sobering effect on pundits who were predicting a totally different outcome.
For these media outlets, the Turkish elections became a black and white issue where the victory of one candidate would supposedly benefit the West, while an Erdogan victory would be highly unwelcome development. But is that really the case?
A lot of nuance is purposely omitted by headlines like the ones that you see here. Yes, Turkey has a strong economic ties with Russia, but so do many European countries. At the same time, Turkey has just voted to allow Finland to join NATO, one of the largest expansions of the military alliance in years. And the echo chamber extends to influential Washington think tanks as well that also parrot a similar line of thinking in the lead up to the elections.
So you're told that if one side wins, it's good for democracy.
But many are questioning whether it's more of a case of the media amplifying the voices of so-called experts who want their own preferred candidate to win. In other words, much of what you may have heard about Turkey's elections from media outlets with millions of subscribers and readers has been fairly inaccurate. Speaking of which, Time magazine's predictions on Turkey's parliamentary elections, where the Erdogan-led coalition took a commanding majority, also turned out to be wrong. Having already secured a majority in parliament, President Erdogan's political mandate to govern will have never been firmer if he wins the second round presidential vote on May 28th. But headlines like this were taken at face value by commentators.
Although this turned out to be wishful thinking on the part of the media.
And that brings us to the next headline. Why did Turkey experts get the election completely wrong? Simple, they underestimated Erdogan's popular support.
This next article by the Daily Sabah, I think, captures the reasoning behind some of the media bias well. It points out that Turkish nationalism played an important role in determining the election outcome. It's a trend that Western media may not have fully comprehended.
Yeah, nationalism was a powerful motivating force for many Turkish voters, according to the results. If anything, the accusations of one-sided Western media coverage may have actually become a political liability for Erdogan's opponents, according to this Daily Sabah analysis.
Both sides in the presidential race are looking to tap into popular nationalist sentiment.
And tapping into that sentiment is, by all measures, just common sense politics. In fact, not so dissimilar from election campaigns that we've witnessed in the US and Europe. And that is an inconvenient fact that has been often overlooked by mainstream media in their reporting on a high-impact election. It's also a useful reminder for the media and for consumers of the media to question assumptions and to look at all the facts before jumping to conclusions.